everybody's trying to figure out how AI fits into the political, social, individual, and of course, IT landscape. People are trying to get out ahead of it. Some people are trying to step out of the way and see what develops. That's what we're talking about on this episode of Utilizing AI. Welcome to Utilizing AI, the podcast focused on practical applications of artificial intelligence from the Futurum Group. Each episode brings together diverse perspectives to explore news and use cases in the way in which AI is transforming enterprise IT and the industries it serves. I'm your host, Stephen Foskett, president of the Tech Field Day Business Unit here at the Futurum Group. Before we dive into the discussion, let's meet who's on the panel today.
Hi, I'm Nick Patience. I'm the AI practice lead at Futurum Research.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer for the TechStrong Group, when we publish TechStrong.ai, among other things.
Absolutely. And, Mike, you and I are on the TechStrong gang quite often talking about news and what's going on in the industry. And of course, AI is just everywhere. It's become front page news for basically everything that's happening in the world today. Nick, let's kick things off by talking a little bit about the ways in which governments are trying to get involved in AI.
Sure, yeah, I think it's been apparent for a long time that AI will be a regulated industry to some extent, to a large extent or another. It already is obviously in China to a much greater extent. But one thing that kind of caught my eye was sort of talk here in Europe. I'm in London, but we still consider ourselves part of Europe. That the European Commission is thinking of watering down somewhat the EU AI Act, which has already passed, hasn't been fully implemented in every country yet, all the 27 countries. But they're talking about that, and there was a story, I think it was in the FT originally, and they were saying about the Commission's come under a bit of pressure from big tech companies, not surprisingly, and they're talking about having year-long grace periods before certain aspects have to be implemented. Those you may remember, it has a kind of a risk hierarchy of unacceptable risk, high risk, medium risk, low risk types of applications, and low risk would be spam filters, so everybody uses it, no problem at all. High risk and things like that would be facial recognition, and unacceptable risk things, facial recognition. So it's an interesting, if that's going to happen. I mean, there's been a lot of talk over the years when the EU was trying to figure this out, that they were trying to put the cart before the horse somewhat and regulate something that hadn't come out yet. In fact, just before they passed it, or they were negotiating, ChatGPT came out, and that caused them then to rewrite drafts. We better get this generative AI stuff in there, and so they were trying to react to that. And now, of course, we've got agentic coming up, and those kind of things. But if for enterprises, for those that this is utilizing AI, so it's it could be relatively good news. And obviously, this is not just EU headquartered companies. This is companies doing business within the EU. So it could help them. It could help enterprises, reduce their immediate term compliance needs and compliance costs and things like that. So it's something I'll certainly be keeping my eye on, because compliance and sovereignty and all these kind of things are really, really key issues in AI.
I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around this whole thing, and I'm hoping you can give me some insights here, because on this side of the pond, it kind of looks like, the EU, for some folks, was going to save us from ourselves and institute all these rules. But there's also people who say maybe there is a legitimate case being made here for not having so many prescriptive rules so early. And other folks, of course, would say, those folks in Brussels will just over-regulate everything, and they're basically going to be just standing in the way. So what is the mood over there?
I think especially in, I may be in London, but especially in continental Europe, it is quite a fundamentally different way of looking at things. And certainly on the data privacy issue. So that's where obviously GDPR, which came into effect in 2018. Those kind of data privacy issues, privacy, call it what you will, is extremely embedded in the culture. And so it does seem a little bit weird, I think, to folks in North America, that kind of obsession. But these things go back with a long and somewhat troubled history. But I think I think there is certainly a case to be saying they were, as I said, put the cart before the horse. The flip side of saying that is, I think there was a 75-year gap between the Model T Ford, the first Model T Fords being shipped, and seatbelts being mandatory in the US. And obviously hundreds of thousands of people died in car accidents between the first and the second thing. This is not the same thing. I'm definitely not on the kind of doom-mongering AI is going to kill us all side of the argument. I think there is certainly, though, data privacy issues that are completely legitimate about what it's not so much what companies collect, because I think that kind of cat's out of the bag. It's whether the government can have access through back doors to your data, and I think that we've seen a lot of issues with that, here in the UK with Apple, and the government, negotiating with them on that. But the EU AI Act is pretty broad, and so it's very sort of risk focused.
Well, on the GDPR front, that's a really interesting point that Mike makes, though. How do they square that on that side of the pond with all of the intense data collection that's gone into the building of these AI models and the kind of data collection that's going to be feeding these AI applications in the future? Are they expected to abide by GDPR rules, or is it sort of like except AI?
I think, except, LLMs and how they vacuum up stuff on the web, I guess a lot of that doesn't really count as data that's private. So, vacuuming up publicly available data is not really covered by it. And so I think it's, from that point of view, while some people worry about it, it's also quite difficult to figure out, obviously, what the training sets were or are, because the companies are not exactly particularly transparent in what they're doing. So I think that doesn't, the LLM kind of aspect, how LLMs were built originally, isn't so much of a GDPR issue. But yeah, it's certainly, and there hasn't been, let's face it, a huge amount of massive cases. It hasn't been all these kind of, because obviously there's revenue. You can be fined up to a certain percentage of revenue, and there hasn't been these kind of 300, 400 billion euro fines administered. So you could argue that it's doing its job, because that has now, or you could argue that it wasn't quite as needed as some in Europe thought it might be.
Yeah, it's pretty surprising, really, that there hasn't been more cases, because, of course, people have legitimate concerns about the kind of data that AI is vacuuming up. But I guess that kind of leads to this whole question: is AI a different animal from all other IT applications, or is this just a Wild West still that hasn't been regulated? Do you think that AI is fundamentally a different animal and needs different types of supervision?
I think if you kind of contrast to something like just a relational database, that's obviously where a lot of this data is stored. We don't have relational database legislation, but that's partly because that's a very that takes humans to put the stuff in there. It's structured and and findable, etc., etc. I think there is something a bit different about AI in the sense that it's it's obviously if you think about the phrase machine learning, it learns, it adapts, it evolves, and that's where that's where the difference comes. So we've gone from kind of just sort of predictive models that they're going to predict an outcome based on a kind of fixed data set, to things that are evolving using enormous training sets that we're not sure what's in them. And so, and as they change and evolve, and models drift and models decay, I think it then becomes issues around explainability become very hard. How can you sit across from if you're a bank, how can you sit across from your regulator and explain exactly how every single decision that you're using AI for was made? You can't. So I think it is different. The volumes of data are just so much larger than anything else, and I think it's just been evolving as we've gone from machine learning, predictive models, to generative AI, to eventually agentic and things like that. So I think it is a bit different. I mean, you haven't had kind of you have regulations around search engines, but not for the reasons of necessarily what they're sucking in. It's more like monopolies and things like that.
I think the regulations may play out a little bit differently too, rather than having some overarching set of rules. I think you're going to see like the regulations that apply to various vertical industries will get tightened around AI, and we'll see extensions to whatever rules we have in place for finance, whatever rules we have for healthcare, as those people get a better understanding of how AI is applied. And that may be more effective ultimately because each vertical use case is different anyway.
Yeah,
I
I think you
suppose
might be
so.
right.
Yeah. But it is interesting to think, though, that, for example, in the copyright world, there's been a lot of trouble with generative AI violating copyright on a wide scale, essentially being able to regurgitate. I don't remember what it was. It was like 87% of Harry Potter or something like that when prompted to. And I've seen similar situations where it has generated specific photos from registered photos from photographers and things like that, if given the right prompts. So that data is in there. I wonder if there's personally identifiable information that it could be coerced into spitting out, even though, Nick, as you say, it's theoretically only been trained on public data, but I think maybe some of our readers might be yelling, or listeners might be yelling at their phone right now to say, no, it's not just public data, because I think people have a suspicion that it goes well beyond what it should have been trained on.
Yeah, I think people also are um, amazingly willing to put public information on the web about themselves. I mean, this is not just sort of LinkedIn things, but other things that you could piece together. So I think it's yeah, I think you're right. The copyright stuff is interesting. Obviously, there's been a bunch of lawsuits, hasn't there? And there's been some settled for publishers. When these some of the early LLMs vacuumed up hundreds of thousands of books, which are some were under copyright, some weren't. But yeah, and there's been some settlements in that regard. And then you've seen all the big publishing companies, New York Times and BBC and all this have kind of agreements with some of these LLMs that they can or cannot use their data for the purposes of training. So I think it was very much in the early days, and by the early days we of course mean just under 3 years ago. Extremely Wild West like, and then within a few months there was some uh, some agreements put in place, but they're very much kind of one on one. This is not legislation based. This is just companies settling or not, as the case may be.
Mhm. I don't know how feasible it is, but I always thought about it this way. I mean, they may have the data, but the issue in my mind, at least, is that they enable people to use the prompts to tease that data out. So if we were better at maybe putting the guardrails in place around the prompts so that people couldn't tease out Harry Potter, then maybe we wouldn't have a crime in the first place, right?
Yeah, I
Well,
mean I
unfortunately,
guess
I think
yeah.
that's easier said than done. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's kind of because generative AI fundamentally changes the nature of security, cybersecurity, doesn't it? Because you can't, whereas previously with machine learning, you could control the input because the input was your bank, what the input into it is going to be, and there's no point with a kind of a decision tree chatbot and trying to manipulate it into swearing or saying something nasty, because all it will do is do you know your account number, date of birth, etc., etc. It's not going to tell you anything else. Not going to tell you Harry Potter. There's no point. But now with generative AI and the chat box, you can't, as the owner of it, you can't really control the input. People will put prompts in, with trying to trick the things and put code in there and stuff like that. And then of course you can't control the output so much. So it does change the threat vectors, as cybersecurity professionals like to say.
Which I guess begs the question, is AI going to be an IT application, or is it going to be, again, back to my original set, is this thing a fundamentally different animal than the other types of applications and data sources that we've relied on in IT for many years? Do you see it differently?
I see it in this regard, um, and people are talking about that here in Atlanta at KubeCon, but there's a difference between training and inference, right? And there's training, that is one thing, and then the inference side of it seems to be moving back towards IT as a deployment model, and they're managing the infrastructure. And Nick, I don't know if you see it differently, but in my mind, a lot of this sovereign cloud conversation that's happening in Europe is very much tied to the fact that these AI workloads need to be centrally managed, secured, and protected. And all of this seems to me screams we need some adult supervision from the IT folks.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as to whether it's different. I think there's certainly shifting. There's been shifts happening towards the buyer changing. Obviously, as there used to be, I didn't like the cliche of every company becoming a technology company. A few years ago, I thought it was way overblown. But I don't really think it is anymore, because I think any sizable company. Everybody has the ability to use Gen AI. Obviously, there's certain things are locked down, but they've got other devices connected to the internet that can do things. And I think the kind of vibe coding shift, no code tools and things like that, and obviously the Gen AI coding tools enable so many people to be able to develop micro apps and things like that. I think it is shifting the buyer pattern. So we are getting more line of businesses involved, line of business people, by which we mean, it's a funny expression. It means everybody other than the IT department. So in most companies, that's virtually everybody. And so you're getting many more inputs into it. Certainly in the early days of Gen AI, and now in the early days of agentic AI, you're getting those people who are driving the experimentation. The issue comes is when we move from experimentation to implementation, and that's where I think IT sort of pulls everything back in to a certain extent. It doesn't matter if it's in cloud, on-prem, hybrid, anything, and gets heavily involved. So I don't think it's like that famous essay that was wrong 20 plus years ago. IT doesn't matter. I don't think that's the case at all. But I do think there's going to be many more people involved in the kind of the top of the funnel stuff in terms of the buying patterns.
I think one of the biggest challenges with AI is just, it is a very different type of application. It works very differently from the way that IT is useful. IT tends to be very reductionist in its thinking. It tends to say, here's the data, here's the network, here's the servers, here's the application, really lining things up along conventional ways. I don't know that AI applications really align nicely to that old way of thinking. I mean, in many ways, it's very similar to the transition to personal computers, the transition to mobile, the transition to cloud, to as a service. AI just takes that to another level in terms of we don't really know what it is. We don't really know where it is. We don't really know what data it's using, maybe. And that makes it, I guess, a little less amenable to the conventional IT mindset.
Maybe, but I would argue that a lot of these, business apps that are going to be built by end users using natural language will suffer the same issues we saw with low code, no code, right? We're going to get a lot of ugly applications. They're going to be insecure and they won't scale. And that's when they're going to call for the IT folks. So IT folks then are going to show up and say, well, here's how you build this. So maybe they're
And
not.
somebody's got to know how to screw these things together, and not going to be the business units.
There's going to be a whole beautiful agentic orchestration layer that we just haven't seen yet. There's certainly a load of every vendor of any size is coming out with those kind of things, which is, I mean, I guess, I know what you mean. I think the agentic stuff, if it does come off, is again a shift. And when these kind of shifts happen, it's not like everybody stops what they're doing before and moves to the new thing. It is an evolution, and I think it'd be foolish of us to kind of think that the agentic stuff is not going to happen to some degree or another. This is not robotic process automation where you wrote a script, but a human wrote a script and just tell a computer to go off and just keep doing the same thing over and over again. This is where with agents, which I think there definitely will have to be orchestration frameworks which will have to be sanctioned by IT, and that will happen because if you think it's kind of scary having users type things. Imagine if you've got other applications deciding with other applications what to build and building their own applications, and you kind of got the ultimate insider threat. From a cybersecurity point of view. So I think it IT will always be around and always be a role for it. I think it's just I think there's a lot, just expanding the footprint of people who consider themselves users of technology, in some cases fairly advanced technology.
And I liken it to, I could diagnose my own issues, right? And I'm using ChatGPT to figure out what's ailing me, but I'm probably better off if I get a professional to tell me to.
I had an interesting conversation last week with a company, Semaphore AI, about how they're trying to do agentic applications, and their idea was that instead of using a conventional approach, or instead of trying to build prompt engineering, that we would use runbooks, essentially document the state, document the process, document what you're trying to get out of it, throw that into the AI model, and see what the AI model can build that achieves your goals. I felt like that was actually a pretty interesting insight, not because it was such a novel approach. I mean, we've been using runbooks in IT for decades, but because it actually kind of meets the users where they are and where they need to be in terms of interacting with these applications. Do you think that that signals that AI is not going to be an IT, a conventional IT application?
I certainly think if that kind of stuff comes past, and you're right, obviously in IT itself, we've been doing it, and Red Hat with Ansible is a good example, and how they've added AI to Ansible runbooks, and I think they're doing some really interesting stuff. But it's only say within that domain. I think yes, I think there will be. If you mean, are there going to be ways that people using natural language will be able to describe what they want and have something get built and go off and do it? Yeah, I think there will be, and I think, but there will obviously be guardrails. Well, you hope there would be, that says, I'm, almost effectively, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. But it's but it's going to be those kind of things are going to be in place. But I think, I think it opens up. I think no code it opens up the idea of building apps to so many other people. No code has been a bit of a disappointment, but I think this is slightly different, with natural language interfaces.
I'm not sure the run book is the right means for managing all this in the future. And I say this because the application environments themselves are going to be much more dynamic. There are going to be a lot more applications built, and they're going to be updated more frequently. And I think the run book is a little bit of a more of a static concept. So I'm wondering at some point, it will be AI agents. I'm just not sure they're going to be invoking some sort of run book that a human created as much as maybe there's some other means for managing IT that is equally dynamic as the environment.
Well, you've been in this space forever, and you're there at KubeCon. You're looking at all this cloud native stuff. What do you think? I know it's probably too much to ask. What's the answer, man? What do you think of the direction that the IT industry is heading in terms of getting their hands around this?
I think everybody is betting heavily on AI agents being able providing the ability to scale, because part of our issue has always been we didn't have enough people to manage the applications, so we didn't deploy as many as we might have possibly could. And everybody's got this huge backlog of applications they theoretically want to build and deploy, but the the limiting factor has always been, well, where do I get the software engineers and the IT people to manage all this? So if we can manage all this stuff at scale using AI agents, that will be great. I just don't think we should abandon first principles of good software engineering because we have a bunch of AI agents out there. I think we need to think that through, make sure those AI agents are trained. And AI agents are voracious and they will do things, unless you specifically tell them not to. And if that's the case, then somebody's got to sit there and orchestrate and manage and, take care of this army of AI agents. So I just think the future of IT is, humans plus AI agents, and there may be thousands of those AI agents, but it requires somebody who actually understands what the objective is of the army.
Yeah, I think you're right, Mike. I think it's more important than ever to not abandon the principles of software engineering. I think it's because of the kind of force multiplier effect of all this, of agents calling agents calling agents. There has to be that kind of discipline in place. Otherwise, truly chaos will reign.
Or as one wag once said to me, it's one thing to be wrong, it's another thing to be wrong at scale.
Well,
Indeed.
and that's kind of bring this conversation around full circle. Then, I guess the question is, do we want to risk getting our cart in front of the horse, like the EU may have done with their AI regulations? Do we want to be very reactive, like IT has often been in the past, and or do we want to somehow strike a balance in terms of getting our hands around the growth of this technology? And what does that mean to business users? So that's a lot. Mike, what do you think? Do we want to get out? Should IT get out in front of this, or is the EU? Did they make a mistake by trying to get out in front of it before ChatGPT was even launched?
Yeah, I think there's a big cultural divide here that you're poking at, right? Because over in the valley, they will say things like "go fast and break things," but they don't actually manage and do anything. They're just providing the tech. And for folks who are, I'll just put a small little simple example in place. But if you're manufacturing yogurt and suddenly the AI is making 50,000 gallons of yogurt that you got no place to ship to, it's a problem. And I don't think people want to see that. And I think business leaders are going to be one saying, well, hold on there, folks. This is real money we're talking about.
Yeah, I think even though AI is a general purpose technology like electricity is or was, it certainly is. I think it will have to come under the purview. Again, we always make mistake, don't we? Every time there's a new wave of, oh, we got to get some of that new wave, rather than what is the problem you're trying to solve and work backwards towards the technology. It happens every single time. It happened with cloud, happened with mobile, happened with Java in the 90s, and so I think. And now look at that. You can consider a lot of these things like Java and cloud and mobile just table stakes. And I think AI will get like that. I do think that there is an old joke in AI, and I may even use it before on this podcast, that the AI is whatever hasn't been invented yet. And so people, there's a kind of you have a problem to solve, you use AI, and then it gets implemented, rolled out, and becomes commonplace, and everybody goes, that's not AI, that's just software. Or well, it is still, but you just don't think it like that. And then AI is trying to solve the next problem along. So I think it is. I think we're going to see a long evolution and constant innovation for decades to come. I think, but it will have to serve the business. Otherwise, it won't be much use to anybody.
I'm laughing to myself because now I'm remembering the days when Wang Labs referred to document processing and said it was AI, right?
Exactly. Yeah, technology is anything that was invented since you were born. I've heard that one. Um, yeah, well, I will say too that I suspect, in answer to kind of this whole question, I suspect that there's going to be sort of a bifurcation in terms from governments, from companies, from consumers, and each of us individually. Some of us are going to try to get out ahead of it and stand in the way. Some of us are going to take a very passive approach. Some of us are going to adopt aggressively. Some of us are going to adopt conservatively. And ultimately, I think that what's going to win the day is the practical benefits that we get from this technology or not. And that will spell whether this is going to have the impact that we expect it will. I think that's a theme that we've heard in each of the episodes so far of utilizing AI. And I suspect that we're going to continue to hear that really at the end of the day, I was talking to Daniel Newman this morning, and one of the things that he and I were talking about was the fact that ultimately the success is the barometer of success. In other words, ultimately, if you're selling, if customers are buying what you're selling, then you have a success. And there's really no other metric for success beyond success. And that's, I think, going to spell what's going to happen with AI as well.
I think there's different forms of AI. When I think about Gen AI in particular, I kind of think you should work backwards from the business process. So if the process itself needs to be done the same way every time, then maybe it doesn't lend itself to Gen AI, which never does anything the same way twice. But if the thing is, I don't know, creating a marketing newsletter or something where it doesn't really matter if it's done the same way every time, then Gen AI might be perfect. And I think there's a spectrum of those things, and people need to kind of sit down and figure it out.
Yeah, exactly right. Like there's hallucination might get a bad name, but in creative amongst creative professionals, that's exactly what you want. So you want it to hallucinate if you're doing marketing collateral, but you also want it if you just want to resize 50 bits of marketing collateral to 50 different sizes so they work differently in format. You don't need a whole load of creativity in that process. You just want it to be correct. And so I think there's going to be there's going to be use cases for all kinds of AI and obviously non-AI technology.
And the risk level on that newsletter going out being wrong is minimal, right? I might be
Well,
embarrassed,
thanks
but
a
I'm
lot
not
for
going to. But the company's not going to go under. You know what I'm saying?
Thanks a lot for joining us on this episode of Utilizing AI. Nick, it's great to see you again. Mike, welcome to this exciting little circus here that we're going to be doing every Wednesday for our listeners. Before we go, Mike, give us a little pitch. Where can we continue the conversation with you, and where can people find your content?
Well, by all means, do check out techstrong.ai, and that website is also one of a series. We have devops.com, Cloud Native Now, Security Boulevard, and we also have TechStrong IT, and they all have an amazing amount of AI content because, well, AI is everywhere.
And Nick?
Sure, yeah, all my research into enterprise AI is on futurumgroup.com. You can find me on Twitter X at Nick Patience. And so, yeah, we're constantly looking at this space and updating all the research for our clients.
Yep. And as for me, you'll find me at Foskett on most social media networks. I'm on TechStrong Gang pretty much every Tuesday, though not this week because I was traveling. And also, of course, you'll find me here at Utilizing AI. Thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode of the Utilizing AI podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know. Drop us a line. Also, maybe subscribe. You'll find us on YouTube or your favorite podcast application. This podcast is brought to you by the analysts and experts from the Futurum Group, where insight meets AI. For show notes and more episodes, head over to techstrong.ai, the Utilizing AI YouTube channel, or TechStrong's TV app. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next week.